If you were to ask me a few years ago what 3 items I would take with me to a desert island, I would likely say 3 Little Caesars pizzas, but that's really just because my roommate and I went through a really weird Little Caesars phase. However, if you were to ask me what 3 items I would take to produce music on a desert island, well then that would necessarily be a different answer. And a few years ago, I definitely would have told you I will take a 7-string guitar, an interface, and my laptop, because really then and now, that's pretty much all any of us are using to make music, right? However, if you were to fast forward to today and ask me that same question, I can confidently say that I'm a little more torn on one of the objects I would take with me to the island. That being a guitar or a bass, which is really weird because I play guitar. Why would I want to take a bass? Well, nowadays an older, wiser, more tuned ears version of myself pretty much is dissatisfied with any song I hear that does not have a really solid bass presence. Back in the day, I totally undersold the value of bass guitar in pretty much any song, even going as far as to not even recording bass sometimes, and then really wondering why my song sounded so small in comparison to other productions I was listening to. Eventually, as the home studio market grew and virtual instruments came through, people started using virtual instruments to record bass, and I eventually found myself doing that as well. But before then, recording bass without a bass guitar was kind of, well, just kind of weird. Recording bass guitar at home without actually owning a bass guitar typically looks something like this. I would plug my guitar direct into the front of my interface, and then after fumbling around for a few minutes to figure out some basic white girl version of a bass riff, I would record that DI signal of my guitar, which sadly always sounded way too much like a guitar DI for it to ever sound like a bass. I would then process that direct signal by pitching the recording down a whole octave, and then attempting to proceed with pretty standard bass processing. So as you can imagine, this pretty much ended up sounding just kind of flubby and gross and really just nothing like a bass at all. So today that had me wondering, would it be easier for me to get a satisfactory bass sound out of my guitar or a satisfactory guitar sound out of a bass? Let's go ahead and hop into Logic and see some of the sounds I was experimenting with earlier. Okay, so here we are in Logic. I want to first take a look at my rhythm guitars with a bass made out of guitar. Let's take a look and see what this sounds like first. Alright, so the riff is pretty sweet and the guitars sound decent. This is a Kemper profile. On the EQ on that, we're just scooping out a whole lot of lows on that and a little bit of mud I was hearing right there. And just doing a low pass as well to get rid of some of that fizz. Okay, so here's the star of the show, of this part of the show, what we want to take a look at, the guitar bass. And in regular old bass processing fashion, I did split a high and a low track, but this is what the guitar bass sounds like just by itself. Even in my headphones, where my bass perception and like the levels of the bass are pretty off compared to using my subwoofer that I typically use, I can just tell that the bass sounds weird. So like I actually did a much more satisfactory job on this than I have on other ways of processing bass with a guitar in the past. But let's listen to the high end. I processed that very similarly to how I would a bass. You see I got rid of some low, a lot of highs, and we're just left with like this high mid-range basically. And I even have the BOD plugin from TSE on there. But it's just something about the pickups and the strings and the fact that it's a guitar that makes it sound, well, like a guitar instead of like a bass. It's kind of weird. All right, let's take a look at the low end on this bass, on this guitar. So if you're listening on your phone or your computer speakers, you may not be able to hear this. Maybe throw on some headphones or some studio monitors. But you can tell like it doesn't sound like the low end of a bass. It kind of sounds like a weird sine wave that's kind of quickly fading in and fading out. And so I did some EQ on there. I tried to boost some of the subs. I didn't even do a roll off on the subs because I was just trying to get as much of that as I could. And then I got rid of like up to 68 hertz. And I also did a ton of saturation here with FabFilter Saturn. So I was really just trying to add as much color to those low frequencies on the guitar bass as I could. And then the max bass basically takes all of that and is essentially almost replacing it with subharmonics. So you add all that together and you get this. Not exactly what you want to hear whenever you're trying to record bass, but I do think that it is doing kind of a weird job, but almost a decent job at holding down the low end in this riff. Let's take a listen next at the bass guitars, or the bass rhythm. It's weird. This was a weird setup. With this particular riff, it really, you will hear it, it doesn't sound good. In doing this, I basically recorded the bass once for each side, left and right, and then I copied and pasted it and did something very similar to what I do with bass guitar just in general. I processed the highs and the lows differently. However, I wasn't really doing the lows. It's kind of like the highs and the low mids. So here's a high track, and you can see I'm already hitting the amp sim with almost no low end, or absolutely no low end. I've filtered almost all the way up to 1,000 hertz. Yes, ma'am. I saw your card on my garage earlier. My wife and I, we moved into the house a little over a year ago now. I don't think she was a previous resident, but the one before that. So I'm not really sure. No, it's okay. No problem at all. Bye-bye. Federal government. Okay, so like I was saying, I hit the front of the amp with basically no low end at all. We're at 1,000 hertz, and that's going into the front of the amp. And for the amp, we're doing STL Tones Will Putney Suite on amp 4, and there's pretty much nothing going on here. I have it on the lead channel, and I turned the gain down a little bit. Even with that, it sounded really, really harsh. So I added another impulse response to kind of just really try to tame some of that really piercing high end. And then I have another instance of Pro Q3, just getting rid of some more sub frequencies. Or not really even sub frequencies, they're just kind of like some weird low cloudy stuff. But you add that in with this other track, which is kind of the low mids version of this. It's up to 170 hertz and down to 785 hertz. And then I just limited it so I could have a little more control over it. So we got that, and we have that pretty much on both sides, I believe. I just have a different impulse response on the right. And that's what we get with that. So it's not exactly what I would call a satisfactory result. That definitely sounds nothing like a guitar. Not that it doesn't sound cool. I would say in this instance, I'm definitely going to pick the guitar bass over the bass guitars, if that makes sense. However, that's when I got to thinking, you know, this project is 152 beats per minute. That is not a slow riff. And the bass guitar is just, you know, a bunch of low frequencies. So I did another riff. Let's see what the other riff sounds like. So we'll take a quick listen at the rhythm guitars and just the guitar bass. So again, a pretty hard riff. I think the bass actually turned out a little bit cooler on this one. I don't know what it is, but the low end sounds way cooler. The high end is still a little bit weird, but I'm much more satisfied with this guitar bass than the previous one. However, the riff, it's fine, but let's take a listen to this. That slaps. This riff is at 110 BPM, and we'll take a look at the two rhythm bass guitars. I did like basically nothing. I don't know if it was because the riff earlier was so fast that there was just a lot of weird buildup going on, but playing this riff with the bass and literally just doing the same thing I did earlier, taking out some of the sub frequencies and hitting the front of the amp differently, I basically didn't do much of anything in the actual amp sim itself. So I mean, that still doesn't sound a ton like a guitar, but it does kind of sound like a guitar that's been pitched down. So I think if anything, we can say that it really comes down to a preference thing. This particular riff sounds cooler with the bass pan left and right than it does with the guitar. I think that sounds way cooler. I think with the riff beforehand, it was a little messy with the bass and the guitar really took it home. So if anything, the answer is it depends, like always. Anyways, let's go ahead and let's get some final thoughts on the riffs with the bass guitar and the guitar bass. So that's what it sounds like when you write bass parts with your guitar and you write guitar parts with your bass. I think if anything from this experience, I learned how to better process a guitar to make it sound more like a bass. That's something I used to try to do years ago, but I really just would pitch it down and kind of just leave it be, and it always sounded really bad. I think with the saturation and limiting and a lot of EQ, you can kind of make your low end sound pretty solid with a guitar. It's really kind of the high end that sounds kind of weird with guitar, which is a different problem than I had years ago when I was trying to do this. However, with the bass guitar serving as your left left and right guitars. I think it seems more like it comes down to the tempo of the riff and the riff itself, and if it lends itself to really kind of pitch down guitars. So I think really the moral of the story is it depends, like it always is the answer. It just depends. So I think if I had to come down to 3 things I'm gonna take with me to the desert island, I'm definitely picking 3 Little Caesars pizzas.